Zetetic, Cosmogony is the book that we'll be reading from today. Zetetic Cosmogony, or conclusive evidence that the world is not a rotating, revolving globe, but a stationary plane circle by rectangle. Preface to second edition. Since the first edition of this work, an unpretentious pamphlet of 48 pages, was published, so much interest in the subject has been manifested that a second edition is without doubt called for. In fact, long after the first edition was exhausted, letters from various parts of the world were received, asking for copies which, to our regret, could not be supplied. In that pamphlet, very much of the evidence we had accumulated from various sources had to be omitted, so as to reduce what otherwise would have been a bulky volume to a short treatise, retaining sufficient evidence to convince the minds of those who would take cognizance of and duly estimate proved facts of nature. Our labors have not been in vain. Many have been enabled to see through the delusions of modern astronomy. Letters from various parts testify that, in some cases, men and women have begun to make use of their brain power, which had been stunted and dwarfed by acceptation, without the slightest proof of the unscientific, unreasonable, unnatural, and infidel teachings of men foisted upon a credulous public in the name of science. Others, again, tell that the writers have thrown to the moles and to the bats the worldwide and almost universally believed hoax that we are living on a whirling sea-earth globe revolving faster than a cannonball travels, rushing through space at a rate beyond human power to conceive. And flying with the whole of the so-called solar system in another direction 20 times the speed of its rotation. To the editors of newspapers who, whether favorably or unfavorably, reviewed the pamphlet, our thanks are due and now respectfully tendered. This edition is sent forth with the assurance of the divine blessing and the firm conviction that truth is strong and must prevail. T.W. Castle Buildings, Durban, Natal, South Africa, November 1899. Introduction. It will be noticed that the style of this volume differs considerably from the first edition. In that edition we divided the book into 4 parts, viz. Scientific assertions, Bible statements, natural proofs, and applications and conclusion. The first of these was covered by extracts from well-known astronomical works. The second was filled with Bible quotations, the direct opposite of the astronomical speculations. The third division contains many proofs of the impossibility of the truth of the globe theory, the last division being made up of the logical arguments founded on the first 3. For convenience of reference, we have arranged the present edition alphabetically. In this way, any particular branch of the subject can be found without looking up the index, and something new is found on every page. Briefly, modern astronomical teaching affirms that we live on a globe, which rotates, revolves, and spins away in space at brain-reeling rates of speed, that the Sun is 1.5 million times the size of the Earth globe, and nearly 100 million miles distant from it. the moon is about a quarter the size of the Earth, that it receives all its light from the sun, and is thus only a reflector, and not a giver of light, that it attracts the body of the Earth, and thus causes the tides, that the stars are worlds and suns, some of them equal in importance to our own, Sun himself, and others vastly superior, that these worlds, inhabited by sentient beings, are without numbers and occupy space, boundless in extent and illimitable in duration, the whole of these interlaced bodies being subject to, and supported by, universal gravitation, the foundation and the father of the whole fabric. To fanciful minds and theoretical speculators, the so-called science of modern astronomy furnishes a field unsurpassed in any science for the unrestrained license of the imagination, and the building up of a complicated conjuration of absurdities, such as to overawe the simpleton and make him gape with wonder, to deceive even those who truly believe their assumptions to be facts, and to make men doubt divine revelation with as little discrimination as they were formerly called upon to believe. If the reader will carefully follow and weigh the evidence in the following chapters, he cannot fail to be delivered from the thraldom of popular credulity and led to seek the truth for himself. Current science declares that the Earth was once shot off from the Sun, a piece of molten rock which by universal attraction became larger, by indrafts from without, as the late R.A. Proctor assures us. This molten mass took 350 million years to cool down, for protoplasm to get a footing, which took millions of years by evolution and selection to produce a Darwinian ape. Evolution and selection allied to and combined with the survival of the fittest, again took many millions of years to evolve primeval man, many ages again elapsing before historical man was produced. There are 4 bodies, according to the late R.A. Proctor, which represent 4 stages of what we may term astronomical progression, as follow. The moon was once inhabited, but is now a chaotic mass. 2. The Earth is inhabited. It was once like the planet Jupiter. Earlier still it was like the Sun, and will become like the moon now is. Jupiter was once like the Sun. It is being prepared for inhabitants. When inhabited, it will be like the Earth. When its race as an inhabited world has been run, it will become like the moon. The Sun will become like Jupiter, and another sun will have taken its place. Later it will become like the Earth, and will then be inhabited. Later still it will become chaotic like the moon, and so on for countless ages, in fact forever. What a grand conception, yea, rather what a grand perversion of the reasoning powers, and what stultification of common sense. What an abuse of precious gifts in order to satisfy a fertile imagination, and supply idle curiosity with something new in the domain of science. No one who reads the Bible but can see how these unfounded speculations are diametrically opposed to its plain teaching. The science of the 19th century and the science of the Bible are totally at variance. If the one be true, the other is necessarily false. Which is it? Let the evidence here placed before the reader answer the question. Let honest-minded men and women who read these pages learn the truth for themselves by practical investigation into the facts herein set forth, which we challenge the whole scientific world to successfully dispute. We court no favor and fear no foe, scientific or otherwise. All we ask is careful attention and practical investigation. We have no fear as to the logical conclusion which shall be arrived at. Contents. Assumptions, page 3. The Age of the Earth, page 4. Aeronautics, page 7. Contrast, page 8. Contradictions, page 11. Circumnavigation, page 18. Curvature, page 21. Canals, page 23. Disappearance of ships, page 24. Distances, page 28. Fluids, page 31. Figure of the Earth, page 33. Growth of the Earth, page 35. Gravitation, page 36. Geology, page 46. The Horizon, page 56. Level on the Term, page 56. Lighthouses, page 58. Midnight Sun, page 62. Motions of the Earth, page 64. The Moon, page 70. Eclipses of the Moon, page 74. Magnetism, page 83. Navigation, page 86. The Pendulum, page 99. The Plurality of Worlds, page 102. The Planets, page 104. Parallel Lines on, page 105. Railways, page 107. Rivers, page 110. Ridicule, page 110. The Sun, page 112. The Sun's Distance, page 113. The Sun's Diameter, page 119. The Stars, page 120. Stars' Distances, 121. Seasons, page 124. Signals, page 125. Surveying, page 126. Science, page 126. The Tides, page 129. The Ultimate Conclusion, page 131. The Appendix, Earth and Irregular Plane, page 153. Evolution, 154. New Scriptures, the 155. Truth Will Conquer, 157. Glory of God, the 159. How Old is the Earth, page 162. Our Earth Motionless, page 167. The Vindication of the Divine Cosmogony, 185.
Zetetic Cosmogony. Conclusive evidence that the world is not a rotating, revolving globe. Assumptions. In order to account for natural phenomena in keeping with the assertions of the learned, many hypotheses have to be laid down, and many unfounded assumptions are absolutely necessary to support the unsound fabric of astronomical imagination. In Modern Science and Modern Thought by S. Lang, the following occurs on page 51. What is the material universe composed of? Ether, matter, and energy. Ether is not actually known to us by any test of which the senses can take cognizance, but is a sort of mathematical substance, which we are compelled to assume in order to account for the phenomena of light and heat. Whatever explanation may be furnished regarding light and heat on this basis must be discarded as utterly untrustworthy, because the premises are assumed. Once upon a time it was stated that the stars were motionless, but as soon as assumption was allowed to talk, the scene was changed, for, as Science Siftings informs us on volume 6, page 39, as soon as it was conjectured that the stars were subject to the law of gravitation, it was inferred that they were not motionless. Professor Huxley had to resort to assumption to account for the disappearance of ships at sea, although had he known the truth of the matter, or taken the trouble to inquire, his unwarranted assumptions would have been totally unnecessary. He says, "We assume the convexity of the water because we know of no other way to explain the appearance and disappearance of ships at sea. What learning! What profound wisdom! If we know of no other way, it is better to admit the fact and wait until we have found out some other way, to explain the difficulty if there is any. Knowledge is gained by practical investigation and experience, and has no need of the assistance of assumption to provide an excuse for ignorance. If water could be proved to be convex, there would be no need to assume it to be so. We should have many proofs and abundant evidence of the fact. But the fact that water has been proved to be level hundreds of times makes it necessary for those who refuse to believe proved facts which tell against their theory to resort to assumption to maintain their unreasoning position. And yet the same professor, in his book Science and Culture, says, the assertion which outstrips evidence is not only a blunder but a crime. The assertion, therefore, that water is convex against proof furnished many times over that it is level is not only a blunder but a crime." The age of the Earth. This is a subject which has been speculated upon. I shall quote a few of the more prominent assumptions. Sir Robert Ball, in his Story of the Heavens, pages 169 and 170, tells us that we cannot pretend to know how many thousands of millions of years ago this epoch was, but we may be sure that earlier still the earth was even hotter, until at length we seemed to see the temperature increase to a red heat, From a red heat, we look back to a still earlier age when the Earth was white hot. Back again till we find the molten surface of our now solid globe was actually molten. But imagination goes still further than this. In Our Place Among Infinities by R.A. Proctor, pages 9 and 10, we find the following. Let it suffice that we recognize as one of the earliest stages of our Earth's history her condition as a rotating mass of glowing vapor, capturing, then as now, but far more actively then than now, masses of matter which approached near enough, and growing by these continual indrafts from without. How we are to recognize that the Earth was once a rotating mass of vapor, we are not told. On what evidence the recognition rests is not stated. Perhaps it is not too much to assume that this is like most other assumptions of the astronomical schools, without the slightest vestige of possibility, to say nothing of probability. Sir R. Ball tells us that we may be sure that the Earth was once actually molten, but on what provable data the surety of this actuality rests, we are left to the foggy mazes of imagination to discover. But imagination, assisted by assumption, will account for anything. And so we are told that it took 350 million years for the Earth to cool down from a temperature of 2000 centigrade to 200. Proctor says that Bischoff has shown this, and so we ought to be sure enough. Were similar ridiculous statements made in relation to any other science than astronomy or geology, I believe the general reader or the general public would dismiss them at sight. But because they are made in a domain of science, where the general reader in most cases cannot follow, they are allowed to pass as the genuine product of learning and investigation, whereas they are at best but wild and utterly impossible theories. In Modern Science and Modern Thought, page 44, we are informed that it is right, however, to state that all mathematical calculations of time based on the assumed rate at which cosmic matter cools into suns and planets, and these into solid and habitable globes, are in the highest degree uncertain. Thus, after all the labor to establish a theory, allied with much skill in setting it forth, in its best dress, we are calmly assured that all these tall figures and imaginations are based on premises which are in the highest degree uncertain. If evidence for rejecting these fanciful hypotheses summarily and in toto were wanting, surely it is now furnished to satisfaction. Not only are these mathematical calculations of assumed premises in the highest degree uncertain, but they are to be classed with the tomfooleries of the age, and reckoned among the many and impossible absurdities of the present day. One of the chief of recent speculations regarding the Earth is that it is a body like the planets, because it has been shown that the sun and the stars are of the same constituent parts as the Earth. Iron, salt, etc. are said to be elements of the sun's composition. And as the Earth contains these and other minerals, it is a globe or planet like the other heavenly bodies, which contain the same metals. What is known as spectrum analysis is relied upon as proving this. A prism is placed in position so as to intercept the sun's rays, and the colors seen through this instrument, red, orange, yellow, blue, are said to be the result of the various metals contained in the sun, in a state of fusion, emitting their several colors in the combined sunlight, which total light is decomposed into its component colors by the prism. With the object of testing the conclusions arrived at by the learned relative to spectrum analysis, several experiments were made by the writer. The light of the sun on a clear day, about noon, seen through the prism disclosed the various colors that can be seen through this instrument. On a hazy day before sunset, the colors seen were the same, but very faint. Light from a lighthouse and a star, seen through the prism, showed the colors to be the same. The color from the light of the star being much less brilliant than that from the lighthouse. The light from a paraffin street lamp gave the same result as light from the star or the sun, only much fainter. And then the electric light was tried. A large street lamp of great power and several others of less power gave the same result as the sun, star, lighthouse, and street lamp, but in various degrees of brilliancy, according to the power of the light. even a candle gave a very faint yellow-blue tinge, so slight that it had to be looked at for some time before anything but blue was apparent. If, therefore, it be argued that spectrum analysis proves that the sun is made of the same materials as we find in the Earth, and that therefore the Earth is a product of evolution, then it is equally clear that the electric light and the gas shade of the lamp which encases it are really composed of iron and various other metals in a state of fusion, constituting indeed a globe of glowing vapor, and not glass, carbon, etc. at all. It is also as reasonable to conclude that the paraffin lamp and the candle are composed of metals in a state of fusion, and that there is in reality no paraffin, no glass, no tallow, and no wick. That is to say, known facts must be thrown aside, common sense stultified, and reason dethroned in order to bolster up the unprovable assumptions of modern science relative to the doctrine of evolution as applies to the Earth and the heavenly bodies. Aeronautics. If the world be a ball, as Sir R. Ball gravely informs us, the aeronaut should be one of his most ardent supporters, as the highest part of the surface of the globe would be directly under the car of a balloon, and the sides would fall away or dip down in every direction. The universal testimony of aeronauts, however, is entirely against the globular assumption, as the following quotations show. The London Journal of 18th July 1857 says, "The chief peculiarity of the view from a balloon at a considerable elevation was the altitude of the horizon, which remained practically on a level with the eye, at an elevation of 2 miles, causing the surface of the earth to appear concave instead of convex, and to recede during the rapid ascent, whilst the horizon and the balloon seemed to be stationary." J. Glacier, FRS, in his work Travels in the Air, states, "On looking over the top of the car, the horizon appeared to be on a level with the eye, and taking a grand view of the whole visible area beneath, I was struck with its great regularity. All was dwarfed to one plane. It seemed too flat, too even, apparently artificial." In his accounts of his ascents in the air, M. Camilla Flammarion states, "The earth appeared as one immense plain richly decorated with ever varied colors. Hills and valleys are all passed over, without being able to distinguish any undulation in the immense plain." Mr. Elliot, an American aeronaut, says, "I don't know that I ever hinted heretofore that the aeronaut may well be the most skeptical man about the rotundity of the earth. Philosophy forces this truth upon us, but the view of the earth from the elevation of a balloon is that of an immense terrestrial basin, the deeper part of which is directly under one's feet." Zetetic Astronomy, page 37. In March 1897, I met M. Victor Emmanuel and asked him to give me an idea of the shape of the earth as seen from a balloon. He informed me that, instead of the earth declining from the view on either side, and the higher part being under the car as is popularly supposed, it was the exact opposite, the lowest part, like a huge basin, being immediately under the car, and the horizon on all sides rising to the level of the eye. This, he admitted, was exactly what should be the appearance of a plane viewed from a balloon. It is almost needless to say that a globe would present a totally different appearance, the highest part being directly under the car. Contrasts. If the Earth be the globe of popular belief, the same amount of heat and cold, summer and winter should be experienced at the same latitudes north and south of the equator. The same number of plants and animals would be found, and the same general conditions exist. That the very opposite is the case disproves the globular assumption. The great contrast between places at the same latitudes north and south of the equator is a strong argument against the received doctrine of the rotundity of the Earth. From the Geological Journal for November 1893, I extract the following. A Voyage Towards the Antarctic Sea, report by William S. Bruce. On January 12, 1893, we saw what appeared to be high mountainous land and glaciers stretching from about 64 degrees 10 minutes west to about 65 degrees 30 minutes south. This, I believe, may have been the eastern coast of Graham's Land, which has never before been seen, but it would be unwise to me to be too certain, for it must have been 60 miles distant. Meteorology. Periods of fine calm weather alternate with very severe gales, usually accompanied by fog and snow. The barometer never attained 30 inches. The records of air temperature are very remarkable. Our lowest temperature was 20.8 degrees Fahrenheit. Our highest, 37.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Only a difference of 16.8 degrees Fahrenheit in the total range for a period extending slightly over 2 months. Compare this with our climate, where in a single day and night, you may get a variation of more than twice that amount. The average temperatures show a still more remarkable uniformity. December averaged 31.14 degrees Fahrenheit for 115 readings. January 31.10 degrees Fahrenheit for 198 readings, a range of less than 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit. This I consider to be very significant and worthy of special attention by future Antarctic explorers. For may it not indicate a similar uniformity of temperature throughout the year? Antarctic cold has been much dreaded by some. The 429 readings I took during December, January, and February show an average temperature of only 30.76 degrees Fahrenheit, this being in the very height of summer in latitudes corresponding to the Faroe Islands in the north. But I believe the temperature of winter will not vary very much from that of summer. This uniformity of temperature partly accounts for the great accumulation of ice which is formed not on account of the great severity of the winter, but because there is practically no summer to melt it. Mr. Seabohm has vividly pictured the onrush of summer in the Arctic, but how different it is in the Antarctic. There is eternal winter, and snow never melts. As far north as a man has traveled, he has found reindeer and hare basking in the sun, and country brilliant with rich flora. Within the Antarctic Circle, no plant is to be found. Report by C.W. Donald, MB, CM. On the passage out, we, on board the Active, touched at the beautiful island of Madeira in October, and 2 more months landed us in the barren Falkland Islands. Sailing thence on December 11th, we crossed the stormy waters to the east of Cape Horn and saw our first iceberg on December 18th. On the same day we sighted Clarence Island, one of the South Shetlands. These are called after our own northern Shetlands, and the part sighted by us lies only some 60 miles nearer the pole. But what a difference between the two places. Our own Shetlands bright with ladies' dresses and light summer garments, and carrying tennis rackets and parasols. The South Shetlands, even in the height of summer, clad in an almost complete covering of snow, only a steep cliff or bold rock standing out in deep contrast here and there. The only inhabitants being birds or seals, and even the bird life, with the exception of the penguins, is scanty. Sir James Ross, on his 3rd voyage, entered the ice at nearly the same spot, and 50 years before, all but a week, had sheltered from a westerly gale under the inhospitable shores of Clarence Island. Its highest point stands 4,557 feet above sea level. The following from Polar Explorations, read before the Royal Dublin Society, is taken from Zetetic Astronomy by Parallax. On the South Georges, in the same latitude as Yorkshire in the north, Cook did not find a shrub big enough to make a toothpick. Captain Cook describes it as savage and horrible. The wild rocks raised their lofty summits till they were lost in the clouds, and the valleys laid covered with everlasting snow. Not a tree was to be seen. Not a shrub even big enough to make a toothpick. Who could have thought that an island of no greater extent than this, the Isle of Georgia, situated between the latitude of 54 and 55 degrees, should in the very height of summer be in a manner wholly covered many fathoms deep with frozen snow? The lands which lie to the south are doomed by nature to perpetual frigidness, never to feel the warmth of the sun's rays, whose horrible and savage aspect I have not words to describe. The South Shetlands, occupying a corresponding latitude to their namesake in the north, present scarcely a vestige of vegetation. Kerguelen, as low as latitude 50 degrees south, boasts 13 species of plants, of which only one, a peculiar kind of cabbage, has been found useful in cases of scurvy, while Iceland, 15 degrees nearer to the pole in the north, boasts 870 species. Even marine life is sparse in certain tracts of vast extent,
and the seabird is seldom observed flying over such wastes. The contrast between the limits of organic life in Arctic and Antarctic zones is very remarkable and significant. Vegetables and land animals are found at nearly 80 degrees in the north, while from the parallel of 58 degrees in the south, the lichen and such like plants only clothe the rocks, and seabirds and the cetaceous tribes alone are seen upon the desolate beaches. McClintock describes herds of reindeer, a perfect forest of antlers moving north in the summer, the eider duck and the brent goose through the air, the unwieldy family of the cetacea through the waters, the Arctic bear upon the ice, the musk ox and reindeer along the land, all wend their way northward at certain seasons. Now these indications are absent from the southern zone, as is also the inhabitation of man. The bones of musk oxen killed by the Esquimaux were found north of the 79th parallel, while in the south man is not found above the 56th parallel of latitude. This is supported by the following from the Western Christian Advocate of 10th February 1897, copied from Appleton's Science Monthly. The distinctiveness of the Antarctic climate, as compared with the Arctic, is found in the relations of both the summer and the winter temperatures. The high summer heat in the few months of its existence has the energy to develop that lovely carpeting of grass and flowers, which gives to the low-lying lands, even to the 82nd parallel of latitude, a charm equal to that of the upland meadows of Switzerland, is, in a measure, wanting in the south. In its place, frequent cold and dreary fogs navigate the atmosphere, and render dreary and desolate a region that extends far into what may be properly designated the habitual zone. The fields of anemones, poppies, saxifrages, and mountain pinks of dwarf birches and willows are replaced by interminable snow and ice, with only here and there bare patches of rock, to give assurance that something underlies the snow covering. Man's habitations in the northern hemisphere extend to the 78th parallel of latitude, and formerly extended to the 82nd. In the southern hemisphere, they find their limit in Fuegia in the 55th parallel, fully 350 miles nearer the equator than where, as in the Shetland Islands, ladies in lawn dresses disport in the game of tennis, and still 700 miles further from the equator in Siberia, Nordenskjold found forests of pine rising with trunks 70 to 100 feet in height. Further to this, we note that seasons on the heliocentric model would work, and are found to work and be accounted for by the variation of the tilt of the Earth in its yearly cycle as it moves around the sun. However, if the factor that is given in mainstream science were to be correct, we would see that this 0.002% difference in the distance caused by the tilt is what they use to attribute this incredible change of temperature. And we also note that if the Earth were spinning at 1,150 miles or kilometers per hour at the equator, and we're spinning around the sun, and we're always at an even pace, that seasons should always be exactly identical, with the same temperatures and the same effects at the same time of the year, every year, year after year, in perpetuity. However, we see that seasons and weather changes every day, and does so in a completely random or seemingly random manner, having nothing to do with warmth moving from southern equatorial regions into the north, or vice versa, from northern cold moving into the southern area. Instead, what we see is vast, drastic changes in the temperatures on Earth. And what we see is that as it's been noted here, that the temperatures of the poles are thoroughly, perfectly regulated and accounted for by the sun's position over the flat Earth, but are completely not accounted for in the heliocentric model, which would have the Earth having to wobble or actually change its tilt drastically many times a year
in order to account for this change in seasons. And even with the tilt, it still wouldn't account for it properly or fully. In The Voyage of a Naturalist by C. Darwin, pages 210 and 212, we are informed that one side of the harbor is formed by a hill about 1,500 feet high, which Captain Fitzroy has called after Sir J. Banks in commemoration of his disastrous excursion which proved fatal to 2 men of his party, and nearly so to Dr. Solander. The snowstorm which was the cause of this misfortune happened in the middle of January, corresponding to our July in the latitude of Durham. We were detained here several days by bad weather. The climate is certainly wretched. The summer solstice is now 25th December past, yet every day snow fell on the hills, and in the valleys there was rain accompanied by sleet. It is utterly impossible to shut one's eyes to the fact that these evidences furnish indisputable proof that the figure of the earth cannot be globular. If it were of that shape, the same conditions would be found at equal latitudes north and south, which we have seen is not the case. Contradictions. The grave contradictions that exist among the recognized teachers of astronomical science ought to cause the thinking man to pause before accepting a theory about which no 2 of its exponents may be found to agree. Sir Isaac Newton, in his Principia, resuscitated the fundamental proposition of Pythagoras thus: the sun is the center of the solar system and immovable. Since then, Professor Herschel discovered that the sun was not immovable. In regard to the atmosphere of the planet Mars, the same contradiction is manifest. In the Christian Million, San Jose, of 9th August, 1894, we find that Mr. Norman Lockyer has been telling an interviewer that Mars is like us in many respects. It has an atmosphere like ours, he says. The Standard of 18th August, 1894 says, Professor Campbell of the Lick Observatory announces that he has demonstrated that Mars presents no evidence of having an atmosphere. Then Mr. J. Gillespie, in his Triumph of Philosophy, page 89, comes to the rescue and says, as to the planets being inhabited, if we take refraction into account, we shall find that there is not such a thing as atmosphere near them. For instance, in an eclipse of the moon, especially at her apogee, the earth is brought to a mere point by refraction, caused by the air of the earth, and were the moon a little further away from this point, would be brought to nothingness. That is, although the earth were exactly in a straight line between the sun and the moon, the earth would not even show a spot on the moon's disk. Now, by this same rule, if either Mercury or Venus had any atmosphere, they could never be seen crossing the sun's disk. I think this is satisfactory proof that they have no atmosphere and cannot, therefore, be inhabited. After all this delightful uncertainty, a writer in Knowledge of February 1895 says, the interesting chapter on solar theories is well fitted to serve as a lesson in modesty. So diverse and conflicting are the various hypotheses, so difficult to harmonize are the observed facts. When we come to consider the atmosphere that concerns us most, the same contradictions are evident. Sir David Brewster, in his More Worlds Than One, tells us that the atmosphere of the Earth extends for about 45 miles. In Science Siftings of 18 March 1893, the following occurs. We may infer that a few hundred miles embrace all the gaseous envelope of the globe. And in Elementary Physiography, page 293, we are told that the height of the atmosphere is not known with any certainty. There is probably no fixed limit to the atmosphere. It is a fair inference from these contradictory statements that present-day scientists, so-called, do not know anything about the height of the Earth's atmosphere. Many men of thought and learning have scouted the ideas imposed upon us by Sir Isaac Newton, of which the following is a sample. The repetition of a blunder is impertinent and ridiculous. To liberate oneself from an error is difficult, sometimes indeed impossible, for even the strongest and most gifted minds. But to take up the error of another, and persist in it with stiff-necked obstinacy, is a proof of poor qualities. The obstinacy of a man of originality when he errs may make us angry, but the stupidity of the copyist irritates and renders us miserable. And if, in our strife with Sir Isaac Newton, we have sometimes passed the bounds of moderation, the whole blame is to be laid upon the school of which Newton was the head, whose incompetence is proportional to its arrogance, whose laziness is proportional to its self-sufficiency,
and whose virulence and love of persecution hold each other in perfect equilibrium. Through the whole of Newton's experiments there runs a display of pedantic accuracy, but how the matter really stands with Newton's gift of observation, and with his experimental aptitudes, every man possessing eyes and senses may make himself aware. It may be boldly asked, where can the man be found possessing the extraordinary gifts of Newton, who would suffer himself to be deluded by such a hocus-pocus, if he had not in the first instance wilfully deceived himself? Only those who know the strength of self-deception, and the extent to which it sometimes trenches on dishonesty, are in a condition to explain the conduct of Newton and of Newton's school. To support his unnatural theory, Newton heaps fiction upon fiction, seeking to dazzle when he could not convince. Goethe, Proceedings of the Royal Institution of Great Britain, Volume 9, Part 3, page 353 through 355. Dr. W. Friend says, "It has over and over again been the hope and expectation of intelligent and unprejudiced men that some less extravagant and more intelligible system would, sooner or later, be found as a substitute for the mathematical romance with which Newton has favored the world. This name has been the sanction for a device which, the more it is examined, excites the more astonishment at its adoption by men of research and observation." Then again, Kepler's law is said to be so well established and so absolutely necessary to the truth of the Newtonian hypothesis, when weighed in the balance by competent judges, are contradicted and set aside by a stroke of the pen. Professor W. B. Carpenter, in the Modern Review for October 1880, says, "It was not until 12 years after the publication of his first two laws that Kepler was able to announce the discovery of the third. This, again, was the outcome of a long series of guesses, and what was remarkable as to the error of the idea which suggested the second law to his mind was still more remarkable as to the third, for not only in his search for the harmony of which he felt assured did he proceed on the erroneous notion of a whirling force emanating from the sun, which decreases with increase of distance, but he took as his guide another assumption no less erroneous, viz., that the masses of the planets increase with their distances from the sun. In order to make this last fit with the facts, he was driven to assume a relation of their respective densities, which we now know to be utterly untrue, for, as he himself says, unless we assume this proportion of the densities, the law of the periodic times will not answer." Thus, says his biographer, 3 out of the 4 suppositions made by Kepler to explain the beautiful law he had detected are now indisputably known to be false. What he considered to be the proof of it being only a mode of false reasoning, by which any required result might be deduced from any given principles. Newton's theory and Kepler's laws are the chief foundation of stones of modern astronomy, and when these are shaken, the whole fabric reels and staggers like a drunken man, until sooner or later it will find a grave in the oblivion that it so well merits. The Daily Chronicle of 8th April, 1891 says, "It may be a surprise to find that we are still imperfectly acquainted with the figure of the Earth." The Ceylon Independent of 23rd December, 1893 has the following: "This question seems to be still agitating the Austrian government, and more than one Austrian man of war that has called here lately has had an officer on board whose special commission was to make observations for the purpose of ascertaining the attraction of the earth in order thereby to arrive at the exact shape of the globe. An officer thus employed is on the Austrian steamer Fasana, who, since the vessel's arrival, has spent a good deal of time at the National Bank, where a room was allotted him for the purpose of adjusting his instruments. An officer engaged on similar duty was on the Kaiserin Elizabeth the other day." Von Gumpach, in his work Figure of the Earth, tells us how the men of science made the world a globe. "The earth of the Newtonian theory is the mere creation of the fancy. Its shape has been determined, partly of imaginary and partly of positively erroneous elements, and results of subsequent experiments and measurements have, by means of purely mathematical factors and tentative formulas, been adapted to its presupposed figure. Mr. J. Gillespie, who believes that the earth is a globe suspended in space, with no revolution round the sun, says in his Triumph of Philosophy, page 6, "I can challenge any astronomer in Great Britain on any point in theoretical astronomy, and prove that the present theory is a regular burlesque, a hoax and a swindle. If it is a sin to tell a lie, what must be the doom of men who teach generation after generation one of the most glaring and degraded falsehoods ever laid before mankind? Dr. Lardner, in his Museum of Science, says, "All the diurnal changes of appearances presented by the firmament, the risings and settings of the sun, moon, and stars, and their varying appearances in different latitudes, admit of being explained with equal precision and completeness, either by supposing the universe to revolve daily round the earth, or the earth to revolve daily on its axis. Then, as to the velocity of light, if light travels at all, the same glorious mixture and uncertainty again presents themselves. Guillemin, the heavens, conjectures that light travels at the rate of 192,000 miles a second. M. Leon Foucault guesses at 184,000 miles per second. Sir R. Ball at 180,000 miles. The editor of Science Siftings assumes, the first time, 186,000 miles. The second time, 196,000 miles. This is all contradicted by a writer in the English Mechanic of 27th July, 1894, who says, "I believe no one now holds the view that light actually moves. Most people think that there is only one school of astronomy in vogue, whereas there are at least four, all at loggerheads with each other. The Ptolemaists, represented by J. Gillespie of Dumfries, who suppose the earth globe a center for the revolution of the sun, moon, and stars. The Koreshians of America, who suppose the earth a hollow globe for us to live inside. The Newtonian Copernicans, who suppose the sun a center, keeping the planets whirling in orbits by gravity. And 4, the Cartesian Copernicans, who suppose the planets to whirl round the sun without the necessity of gravity. Sir R. Phillips heading up this school. Astronomy will sometimes summon geology to its aid, when difficult problems are awaiting solution, but astronomers generally claim that when the two sciences disagree, astronomy is the safest assumption. S. Lang, however, in his Modern Science and Modern Thought, claims superiority for geology. On pages 48 and 49 he says, "The conclusions of geology, at any rate up to the Silurian period, are approximate facts and not theories, while the astronomical conclusions are theories based on data so uncertain that while in some cases they give results incredibly short, like that of 15 million years for the whole past process of the formation of the solar system, in others they give results almost incredibly long, as in that which supposes the moon to have been thrown off when the earth was rotating in 3 hours. The safest course in the present state of our knowledge seems to be to assume that geology really proves the duration of the present order of things to have been somewhere over 100 million years. Thus, one fable, falsely called science, exposes another fable of about the same value. The safest course in the present state of the utter ignorance of science as to the matters here in dispute is certainly to reject both these delusions and seek the truth for ourselves. Geological blunders have been many and frequent, but they are seldom allowed to reach the eyes or ears of those who are duped into believing all this imposing science teaches. The Daily Chronicle of 14th January 1893 speaks pretty plain, and proves the truth of the above remarks. The paper says, "A geological blunder. There is in Nature an article by a French writer on Sir Archibald Geikie, Director General of the Geological Survey, which is just now causing a good deal of talk amongst English men of science. Of course, nobody is surprised at the fulsomeness of M. de la Parent's eulogy, as Nature seems to exist for pushing the great official scientific syndicate of Huxley, Hooker, Geikie & Co., Limited, very strictly limited, which may be said to run science in England. M. de la Parent would probably not have been permitted to write anything about a member of it unless it was fulsome. What has really amazed people is the audacity with which a famous historic bungle on the part of the Geological Survey is glossed over, and the Director General not only credited with the work of those who exposed and corrected it to his utter discomfiture, but actually covered with laurels for thus one of the most glorious scientific conquests of the century. The whole thing is delightfully characteristic of state-endowed science in England. If you are one of the official syndicate who run it, you may blunder with impunity and make your country ridiculous at the taxpayer's expense. Scientific men who can correct you shrink from the task. They know that the syndicate can boycott them, and by intrigue can keep them out of every honor and profit, and that the syndicate satellites can write and shout down everywhere independent, non-official critics. They also know that if, perchance, some particular intrepid person does succeed in exposing one of the syndicate, they can always, by the same means, after the public has forgotten the incident, suppress him and boldly appropriate to themselves the credit of his work. The geological secret of the Highlands, with the unlocking of which Sir Archibald Geikie is now credited, was really made a puzzle for more than half a century by the blundering of the Geographical Survey and Director General Sir Roderick Murchison, and famous courtier and society geologist of the last generation. In the Highlands he saw gneisses and ordinary crystalline schists resting on Silurian strata, and he foolishly held the sequence to be quite normal. The schists, he would have it, were not archaic formations, but only metamorphosed Silurian deposits. He also held that primitive gneiss was not part of the molten crust of the globe, but only sediments of sand and mud altered by intense pressure and heat. Murchison, not to put too fine a point on it, bounced everybody into accepting this absurd theory, and the whole forces of the Geological Survey, with its official and social influence, together with the unscrupulous power of the official syndicate which then, as now, jabbed science wherever it had a state endowment, were spent in perpetuating the blunder and blasting the scientific reputation of whoever scoffed at it. But in the natural history school at Aberdeen University it was scoffed at. The late Dr. Nicol, professor of natural history in Aberdeen, proved that Murchison and the survey were wholly wrong, his proof being as complete as the existing state of science allowed. When he died, Dr. Aileen Nicholson took the same side, and for years, in relation to this grand problem, it was Aberdeen University against the world. In shouting the last word, no voice has been louder than Sir Archibald Geikie's. It is therefore diverting to find his official biographer stating in Nature that all the time he was wrestling in foro conscientia with doubts as to the soundness of the official position, and that finally his love of truth prompted him to order a resurvey of the whole Highland region. In plain English, the taxpayer, having had to pay for Murchison's bungling survey, was, because of his successor's love of truth, to enjoy the luxury of paying over again to correct it. The real truth, however, is this. When it was supposed that the Aberdonians were finally crushed, there arose in England a young geologist called Lapworth, who had the courage to revise the whole controversy and take sides with the Aberdeen school. As he developed an extraordinary genius for stratigraphy, he not only broke to pieces the official work of the Geological Survey in the Highlands, but by revealing the true secret of the structure of that perplexing region, he played havoc with the Murchisons and the Geikies and all their satellites, convicting them of bungling and covering them with ridicule. Nature, in fact, in these parts, had suffered from a much more powerful emetic than Murchison imagined, and when bits of the primitive crust of the globe were thrown up and pushed on the top of more recent deposits, Murchison jumped to the conclusion that they were of later date than what they lay on. It was a terrible blunder, as the Aberdeen men persistently held, and we do not wonder that Sir Archibald Geikie, who rose to place and power by defending it, is anxious to have his connection with it veiled by a friendly hand. But it is rather outrageous for the friendly hand to give him the credit of conceding the very error which he defended to the last gasp, and deprive Professor Lapworth of the honor of having banished it from science. One of the most diverting things, however, in the article in Nature, is that Sir Archibald Geikie is belauded because, when frightened by the stir Professor Lapworth's paper, made in 1883, he was fain to send his surveyors to go over the Highlands again. He, as their official chief, ordered them to divest themselves of any prepossession in favor of published views, and to map out the actual facts. Old Colin Campbell, when he objected to the institution of the Victoria Cross, said it was as absurd to decorate a soldier for being brave as a woman for being virtuous. He did not foresee a still greater absurdity, that of eulogizing a man of science because he instructed his assistants to tell the truth when conducting an investigation into his own blunders. From the Daily Chronicle, Saturday, January 14th, 1893. And in a further issue, the same paper says, Sir Archibald Geikie, Director General of the Geological Survey, has at last taken notice in Nature. We need hardly say of our article condemning the attempt to give the survey all the credit of some of the most remarkable discoveries of the age, which have really been made by men unaided by the state, in toiling for daily bread as teachers of science. We had heard something that caused us to expose this scandal. The fact is the official ring of state-endowed science, not content with jobbing the Royal Society and its distinctions, as their critics have been showing in the Times, are meditating a raid on the taxpayer. They want more money, and as a preliminary step their official organ, Nature, of course begins to boom their work and reparations and reputations. This is a good old game. The only novelty in this situation is that a daily newspaper, for the first time in history, ventured to show it up. We do not desire to be harsh to the illustrious scientists at Nature. It is the duty of all official organs to make big men out of small material. But when they begin to do this by coolly confiscating the achievements of private and independent workers for one of the managing partners of the great firm of Huxley, Geikie, Dyer & Co., Limited, we thought it time to protest. The letters that have been appearing in the Times make some funny revelations about the way the Royal Society is worked. Sir Archibald Geikie's defense suggests that if the Times only followed up the game it scented, it would show its readers plenty of sport. We ourselves would make no objection to a vote of money in aid of researches into the frank and practical manner in which, and the terms on which, the official gang of science frequently acknowledge the achievements of young outsiders. The Daily Chronicle, Feb 2, 1893. Modern astronomy has been set down as the most exact of all the sciences, and geology said to be little less than infallible. The reader may form his own conclusions from the above extracts. Circumnavigation is said to be one of the best proofs that the Earth is a globe. It is often asserted, generally by those who have not the remotest idea of the subject, that ships have sailed round the world on one course, east or west, and come back to the place where they started from. It will be a surprise to such to be informed that this wonderful feat of navigation has never yet been accomplished, that it is most unlikely that it will ever become a fact, and that it would take several of the proverbial small fortunes to successfully carry it out. Some people think it is quite an easy matter to start from, say, Liverpool and steer west and come back to the starting point. Suppose we attempt such a journey. After crossing the Atlantic, we must leave the ship and traverse the American continent. As there are no roads running due west, we should have to take the sun's bearing almost hourly to keep us on the true course, sometimes having to cross private property, travel through cultivated lands, and in some cases to go through other people's houses to preserve a westerly course. Suppose we arrive at the other side and then took ship across the Pacific. We should again have to travel across the continent, thousands of miles, to get back to the North Sea, and then across it, in England, we might arrive at Liverpool. If anyone thinks this possible, he ought to try it. If the reader will scan the surface of a school globe, he will at once see that if such a thing should ever be attempted, no reasonable hope of success could be entertained, unless the attempt were made in the extreme south. Suppose a ship to start from Cape Point, latitude 34 south, and steer east. The first land encountered would be Australia. She would then have to go south to clear the land, and so could not return to her starting point on an easterly course, but would have to take many courses to return there. Let the ship start from Cape Horn, in latitude 56 south, and steer west. She would soon encounter islands and would have to alter her course to north or south to clear them, and so could not get back to Cape Horn on a westerly course. The same would apply on an easterly course. It is evident, therefore, that the Earth can only be circumnavigated on one course in the extreme south. There, the dangers of icebergs, of magnitudes never met with in the north, and darkness during a great part of the year, would render such an expedition costly, dangerous, and of long duration. Say a vessel starts on an easterly or westerly course in latitude 65 south. She could only sail during the very finest of summer weather, and would have to come north during the winter. Returning to her last point, she could again start on the course round the world, and continue so long as the fine weather lasted, repeating the process of going north during the dark and winter months. That this would occupy a long time and cost a deal of money is plain enough to anyone willing to be convinced. For these reasons, I am of opinion that no ship will ever sail round the world on one course and come back to her starting point. And yet some globe is the world. One of the greatest feats of navigation will tell you that it has been done scores of times, and proves in seamanship that man could undertake, and which has never yet been attempted, is spoken of as though it were a matter of almost daily occurrence. And who but the astronomers are responsible for such like fallacies in schoolbooks and astronomical works? Who but those famed for learned ignorance are answerable for the foolish arrogance and stupid credulity of the masses on this subject? Can there be any truth in a science which is founded on conjecture and supported by so-called facts as proof of its correctness, which facts have never existed outside the brains of their inventors? If it were said that a vessel could sail round the world, allowing for deviations for land, ice, and other obstacles in the way of her making one course, so that by making many and various courses she could at length return to her starting point, I would have no quarrel with the propounders of circumnavigation. But if the general statements on the point were reduced and brought within the compass of fact, in language such as the above, the supposed proof of the world's rotundity would be annihilated. In Ever's Navigation, it is stated that a vessel may leave a port, sail round the earth, and come back to her starting point on one course. This I have no hesitation in stating is absolutely false. If otherwise, I should be glad to be informed of the name of the port. The learned are beginning to see through the fallacy of the circumnavigation proof of the world's rotundity, as the following from Elementary Physiography by Professor Richard A. Gregory, FRAS, clearly shows. Quote, "The earth has been circumnavigated a great many times, and it is a common occurrence for a ship to leave England, and by steering westward all the voyage to arrive in England again without retracing an inch of her way. Similarly, we can journey round the globe, sometimes traveling on land, and sometimes on the sea, but eventually returning to the starting point without at all turning back on our course. This would appear to be a certain proof that the earth's surface is curved. Nevertheless, it has been pointed out that circumnavigation would be possible if the earth had a flat surface, with the north magnetic pole at its center. A compass needle would then always point to the center of the surface, and so a ship might sail due east and west, as indicated by the compass, and eventually return to the same point by describing a circle." D. Wilson Barker, R&R, FRSE, remarks in his work on navigation, quote, "The fact that the earth has been sailed round is not sufficient proof as to its exact shape." After these authoritative statements, we may hope that this so-called proof of the globular shape of the earth will soon be expunged from the textbooks. This is written in the 1890s. It has yet to be expunged from the textbooks. We've since had 2 major world wars and a non-stop conglomeration of other small wars in between. And it doesn't look like the textbooks are anywhere close to on their way to changing. Curvature. In Chambers' mathematical tables, the curvature of the globe is given as 7.935 inches to the mile, varying inversely as the square of the distance. If it be required to ascertain the curvature on a globe of 25,000 statute miles equatorial circumference, square the distance and multiply by 7.935 inches. The result is the curvature. Thus, in 6 miles there is a dip of nearly 24 feet, in 30 miles nearly 600 feet, and so on. In Mensuration by T. Baker, C.E., the correction for curvature is said to be 7.962 inches to the mile. These 2 equations so nearly agree, and amount to just about what the correction would be on a globe of the size the Earth is said to be, that they may be taken as correct. If, therefore, the world we live on is a globe, it is a simple matter to find out how far any object at a given height can be seen. In September 1898, I received a letter from Australia, in which the writer says, "In the year 1872, I was on board the ship Thomas Wood, Captain Gibson from China to London. Owing to making a long passage, we ran short of provisions, and so short after rounding the Cape, that the captain spoke of putting into St. Helena for a supply. It was then my hobby to get the first glimpse of land, and in order to do this I would go up to the topgallant yard and make a survey, just as the sun would be rising. The island was clearly in view, well on the starboard bow. I reported this to Captain Gibson. He disbelieved me, saying it was impossible, as we were 75 miles distant. He, however, offered me paper and pencil to sketch the land I saw. This I did. He then said, "You are right," and shaped his course accordingly. I had never seen the island before, and could not have described the shape of it had I not seen it. St. Helena is a high volcanic island. If my informant had seen the top only, there would have to be an allowance made for the height of the land. But as he sketched the island, he must have seen the whole of it, which should have been 3,650 feet below the line of sight, if the world be a globe, deducting 100 feet for the height of the yard he viewed it from. In Chambers' Information for the People, section on Physical Geography, page 59, the following occurs. In North America, the basin or drainage of the Mississippi is estimated at 1,300,000 square miles, and that of the St. Lawrence at 600,000 square miles, while northward of the 50th parallel extends an inhospitable flat of perhaps greater dimensions, so more than 1.3 million square miles, or 600,000 square miles. North of the 50th parallel extends an inhospitable flat of greater dimensions. Next in order of importance is that section of Europe extending from the German Sea through Prussia, Poland, and Russia towards the Ural Mountains, presenting indifferently tracts of heath, sand, and open pasture, and regarded by geographers as one vast plain. So flat is the general profile of the region that it has been remarked it is possible to draw a line from London to Moscow, which would not perceptibly vary from a dead level. The foregoing is a London to Moscow proof that the surface of the world is not globular. On a globe, no matter how powerful the glass, only a certain distance could be seen, as the roundness of the globe would prevent a glass from seeing round it, and its thickness would equally prevent one seeing through it. But in fine weather, objects at distances out of all proportion to what the curvature would allow are visible with the assistance of a good glass. The following from The Voyage of a Naturalist by Charles Darwin, page 166, illustrates this point. The guanaco, or wild llama. Mr. Stokes told me that he one day saw, through a glass, a herd of these animals which evidently had been frightened, and were running away at full speed, although their distance was so great that he could not distinguish them with the naked eye. From the Atlas of Physical Geography by the Reverend T. Milner, M.A., I extract the following. Vast areas exhibit a perfectly dead level, scarcely a rise existing through 1,500 miles, from the Carpathians to the Urals. South of the Baltic, the country is so flat that a prevailing north wind will drive the waters of the Statiner Half into the mouth of the Oder, and give the river a backward flow 30 or 40 miles. The plains of Venezuela and New Granada, in South America, chiefly on the left of the Orinoco, are termed llanos, or level fields. Often in the space of 270 square miles, the surface does not vary a single foot. The Amazon only falls 12 feet in the last 700 miles of its course. The La Plata has only a descent of 1/33 of an inch a mile. These extracts clearly prove that the surface of the earth is a level surface, and that, therefore, the world is not a globe. And when we come to consider the surface of the world under the sea, we shall find the same uniformity of evidence against the popular view.
To 1872, when a British research vessel, HMS Challenger, set out on the first ever mission to map the ocean floor.
Throughout most of recorded history, men had just assumed that beyond a certain level the sea was pretty flat, pretty dead, fairly lifeless. They weren't expecting to find anything very interesting.
For 4 years, the Challenger crisscrossed the oceans, covering 70,000 miles. The crew plumbed the depths every 140 miles, using a total of 249 miles of rope and hundreds of pounds of lead weight. It was tedious, backbreaking work, but at the time it was the only way to measure the depth of the ocean floor. When they got to the Western Pacific, 200 miles off the island of Guam, the crew routinely lowered the rope for a measurement. But the weight kept on dropping and dropping.
It's a big surprise. Nobody thought the ocean was this deep. So all of a sudden we've got scientists saying, why is that?
Eventually, the weight struck the bottom at 4,475 fathoms, nearly 5 miles beneath the ocean's surface.
The scientists will be going, wow, we've found something, and what does it mean? Is it a little hole? Is it a big hole? What kind of feature is it down there? There's a whole lot of questions you get when you find this one spectacular reading.
The Challenger expedition marked the birth of modern oceanography and provided the first crude map of the ocean floor. It showed how the ocean floor gently slopes away from the land and then plummets thousands of feet into vast flat plains.
In Nature and Man by Professor W.B. Carpenter, article The Deep Sea and Its Contents, pages 320 and 321, the writer says, "Nothing seems to have struck the Challenger surveyors more than the extraordinary flatness, except in the neighborhood of land, of that depressed portion of the Earth's crust which forms the floor of the great oceanic area." Quote, "Nothing seems to have struck the Challenger surveyors more than the extraordinary flatness of the Earth's crust which forms the floor of the great oceanic area. If the bottom of mid-ocean were laid dry, an observer standing on any spot of it would find himself surrounded by a plain only comparable to that of the North American prairies or the South American pampas. The form of the depressed area which lodges the water of the deep ocean is rather, indeed, to be likened to that of a flat waiter or tea tray, surrounded by an elevated and deeply sloping rim, than to that of the basin with which it is commonly compared." This remarkable writer tells of thousands of miles in the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the great southern ocean beds being a plain surface, and from his remarks it is clear that a flat surface is the general contour of the bed of the great oceans for tens of thousands of square miles. Canals. If the earth be the globe of popular belief, it is very evident that in cutting a canal, an allowance must be made for the curvature of the globe, which allowance would correspond to the square of the distance multiplied by 8 inches, nearly. From The Age of 5 August 1893, I extract the following. Quote, "The German Emperor performed the ceremony of opening the gates of the Baltic and North Sea Canal in the spring of 1891. The canal starts at Holtenau, on the south side of Kiel Bay, and joins the Elbe 15 miles above its mouth. It is 61 miles long, 200 feet wide at the surface, and 85 feet at bottom. No locks are required, as the surface of the two seas is level. Let those who believe it is the practice for surveyors to make allowance for curvature ponder over the following from the Manchester Ship Canal Company, Earth Review, October 1893. It is customary in railway and canal constructions for all levels to be referred to a datum which is nominally horizontal, and is so shown on all sections. It is not the practice in laying out public works to make allowance for the curvature of the earth." The Manchester Ship Canal Company, Engineer's Office, 19th February 1892. A surveyor, Mr. T. Westwood, writes to the Earth Review for January 1896 as follows. In leveling, I work from ordnance marks or canal levels to get the height above sea level. I work sometimes from what is known as the Wolverhampton level. This is said to be 473.19 feet above sea level. Sometimes I work from the Birmingham level. This is said to be 453.04 feet above sea level. Sometimes I work from the Walsall level. This is said to be 407.89 feet above sea level. The puzzle to me used to be that, though each extends several miles, each level was and is treated throughout its whole length as the same level from end to end, not the least allowance being made for curvature, although if the Earth were a globe, 112 feet ought to be allowed. One of the civil engineers in this district, after some amount of argument on each side as to the reason why no allowance for curvature was made, said he did not believe anybody would know the shape of the Earth in this life. I think most will grant that a practical man is capable of forming a judgment, in all cases of more value than the merely theoretical calculator. Here, then, we have the evidence of practical men to the effect that no allowance for curvature is made in cutting canals. A clear proof that we are not living on a huge ball, but on a surface, the general contour of which is level, as the datum line from which surveys are made is always a horizontal line. Disappearances of ships at sea. J.W. Draper, in his Conflict Between Religion and Science, page 160, says, "The circular visible horizon and its dip at sea, the gradual appearance and disappearance of ships in the offing, cannot fail to incline intelligent sailors to a belief in the globular form of the Earth. The circular visible horizon amounts to nothing, because if we take our stand in a large square of, say, 20 miles, the visible horizon will be circular, any point in the distance being the edge of the circle of vision. If we measure off a square of 100 miles or so, the vision will be bounded by a circle, the limit of sight, so the circular visible horizon may at once be dismissed. But its dip at sea is just what has never been seen. It is the very thing that requires to be seen to establish the globular theory. Wherever we look at sea, the water extends in one straight line, as far as the eye can reach. A flat surface is always seen, and ships are seen at distances altogether out of proportion to the allowance to be made for convexity, if the surface were a convex one. When a ship or any other object recedes from the observer on a level surface, the highest part is always seen last by reason of perspective, so that the masts and sails of a receding vessel on a flat surface should be seen long after the hull has become invisible to the naked eye. Besides this law of perspective, the hull of a vessel is generally of a dark color, and often at a very short distance disappears to the naked eye, because it has lost its individuality in the mass of surrounding water, both hull and water being nearly of the same color. It appears to have mingled with the water, and is thus lost to sight. The hull has no background whatever, but the masts and sails have a splendid background against the sky, and stand out to advantage, and are, for this reason also, seen long after the hull has vanished. But that the hull has not gone down behind a hill of water, that it is not because of the globular surface of the water that it is invisible, has been proved by the writer many times. At Cape Town some time ago I made special experiments with a view to arrive at the truth of the matter. On one occasion I watched the schooner Lilla of Cape Town sail away north, bound to Saldanha Bay. Instead of gradually going down the hill of water, the observer always being on the highest part, she appeared to ascend an inclined plane until she reached the level of my eye, perhaps 100 feet above sea level, and then gradually diminished in size. Soon her hull disappeared. It was painted black, and her masts and sails became smaller and smaller every minute. I then applied a binocular to the eye, and saw her hull plainly enough. It remained in sight until the individuality of the vessel's parts were lost in the distance. The iron bark La Quereda of Liverpool sailed out of the Table Bay bound to Australia. I watched her until the hull had completely disappeared, but, on applying the glass, saw it as clearly as possible, and this when the vessel was at least 10 miles away, so that the hill of water in both these instances was imaginary only. In May 1895, I was a passenger on board the USS Goth. In Algoa Bay, I gave a brief lecture on the subject of this work, and had much discussion with some of the passengers, one affirming he could believe all I said, with the exception of the way I accounted for the disappearance of ships at sea. I replied that we would likely see one of the ships, and then it could be tested. Next day, I observed a vessel about 10 miles away, but though the masts and sails were pretty clear, the hull was not to be seen. Applying the glass, I saw the hull, as plain as any other part of the ship. I called the gentleman with whom I had the previous day's conversation, and showed him the vessel. I asked him to look at the ship for some time, so as to be quite sure whether the hull was visible or not. After looking a minute or so, he was quite certain that the hull could not be seen. I asked him why it was invisible. "Because," he said, "it is hidden behind a hill of water, the surface of the ocean being convex." I asked him if he believed my glass could see through a hill of water, and gave him the astronomer's curvature for the distance, which he admitted to be 10 miles, as 10 by 10 by 8 inches equals 66 feet, less 20 feet for height of eye and 10 feet for height of the other vessel's hull, equals 36 feet. The hull should have been below the water. He replied that the glass could not, of course, see through a hill of water, and applied it to his eye. Great was his astonishment on seeing the hull, but equally ready was his confession that the theory of the Earth's rotundity, founded on the disappearance of ships at sea, was false. On a steamer in March 1897, when near St. Helena, my attention was called to a large vessel, just before sunset. With the naked eye, the masts and sails were visible enough, but nothing of the hull could be seen. On applying the glass, there appeared to be no difference, and I was for some time lost in wonder. But as the sun got lower in the heavens, I noticed that the vessel's hull was overshadowed by banks of black clouds low down on the water, and thus could not be seen. The hull was enveloped in dense blackness and was lost to the eye. But as soon as the sun was low enough to counteract this effect, I saw the hull quite plain with the glass, when only the sails were visible to the naked eye. Between and Southampton, we sighted a large four-masted steamer astern of us. The hull was also plainly to be seen. The vessel appeared to be in ballast. Our ship's officers said she was 12 miles away, and I think the distance was not less. For 2 whole days she was visible to us astern, sometimes the hull being quite plain, at other times being invisible, thus proving that the state of the atmosphere has more to do with the matter than globularity, if it existed, could have. According to the globe theory, an object plainly visible to the naked eye and seen by scores of people should have been 96 feet below the horizon, allowing both vessels to be the same height above the water, which was as near as possible correct, as our ship had scarcely any cargo on board and presented a high side out of the water. Another witness. Quote, to the editor of the Earth Review, "Sir, in August last, I, with several other friends, being in Oban for a holiday, took a trip for a day in a small yacht on Loch Lorne, and being a glorious sunshiny day and so calm that not a ripple was seen, and being becalmed for an hour about midday, we observed a good many sights of various kinds. Amongst other things that we saw was a yacht, which the captain told us was 12 miles distant. We saw all the masts and part of the hull, and to get a better view of her, we took our binocular opera glass, a good one. Now, sir, wouldn't it require a funny curvature table either with or without the odd fractions, to explain how we saw the hull of that vessel 12 miles off? According to a table furnished by the present Astronomer Royal recently, it ought to have been 66 feet below the line of sight. But the table that we saw it from was the side of our yacht, and we concluded the sea was level. Yours respectfully, John Smith, Siddle, Halifax. The following is from 100 Proofs that the Earth is not a globe. If we take a trip down the Chesapeake Bay in the daytime, we may see for ourselves the utter fallacy of the idea that when a vessel appears hull down, as it is called, it is because the hull is behind the water. For vessels have been seen and may often be seen again, presenting the appearance spoken of, in a way far away beyond those vessels, and at the same moment the level shoreline with its accompanying complement of tall trees, towering up in perspective over the heads of the hull-down ships. The following is from Chambers' Journal of February 1895, page 32. A good many years ago, a pilot in the Mauritius reported that he had seen a vessel which turned out to be 200 miles off. This incident caused a great deal of discussion in nautical circles at the time, and, strange to say, a seemingly well-authenticated case of the same kind occurred afterwards at Aden. A pilot there announced that he had seen from the heights the Bombay steamer then nearly due. He stated precisely the direction in which he saw her, and added that her head was not then turned towards the port. 2 days afterwards, the missing steamer entered the port, and it was found on inquiries that at the time mentioned by the pilot she was exactly in the direction and position indicated by him, but about 200 miles away. Under exceptional conditions of the atmosphere, therefore, enormous distances can be penetrated by the unaided eye, and with a good telescope, objects at distances totally out of proportion to the globular theory can be seen. Take the case of the above steamer. If the globe theory be correct, this vessel would have been 4 miles below the line of sight, allowing 1 mile for height of observer, and thus, even when aided by the most powerful telescope ever invented, could not have been seen. Once more, it dawns on the thinking man that the world is not the globe of popular credulity, but an extended, motionless plain.